So I'm going to be really honest with you guys. I was talking to Rudy before the service, and I was expressing to him a little bit of my nerves getting up before my family to share my heart. And, one of the things that he kind of inadvertently let me onto was just be real. He talked about Pastor Mike, our lead pastor, who's on vacation this week with his family in Nashville. And he said that he used to sit in the room with a bunch of people, and he would think to himself that, these guys, they're not telling me the truth. But with Mike, he always knew, this guy's telling me the truth. And I get the same feeling. I showed up here at the Line Church a little over a year ago, and I immediately connected to Mike's sermons. In fact, before I came, and you guys have maybe heard me say this before, but I mapped out where we were going to live, and I put pins all over this Google map with churches all over. And listened to like 30 sermons to try to prepare to what church that I wanted to go to, because I'm a nerd and that's what they do. I read every single website and every single link, and there was a truth to Pastor Mike. And so I just want to try to step and follow in his footsteps in that. And as I get up here to speak with you guys this morning, just be really, really honest and be really transparent. And in that vein of transparency, I'll share with you that I was very nervous coming up to this. The last time that I preached, I had this sermon in the can that I had been working on for years, the Lord had been speaking to me. And so when Pastor Mike was like, hey, you want to preach? I said, absolutely I do. And I didn't even have to write up notes. I already had them written up from long before. So I came into that week really confident and really on top of the world. I knew exactly what I was going to say. I knew exactly how I was going to say it. And I thought I did a decent job. So this week, and don't let me play a victim. I mean, Pastor Mike was like, hey, I want you to speak. I said, absolutely. I didn't even think twice about it. I love doing this, but as I've been going over my notes and writing out what I believe the Lord was trying to say to us this morning, I really had a lot of stress. And I'm not a nervous person, but I love you guys a lot. And so getting up in front of you guys makes me nervous. And I was talking to my best friend from Oklahoma last night, and I was telling him this, and he's heard me preach many times throughout my life. And I said, man, I'm just wrecked. I said, I'm going to do a terrible job. I don't know what to do. And he said, Josh, it doesn't matter what you say. Do what you do every single day. Yell about how much people need Jesus, and I promise you it'll go fine. So this morning, I thought it was fitting that Jeremy tells that story, and we sing that song for Freedom Reigns, and because I'm moved to talk about Jesus. That's what I know best. I can tell you that I lived an entire Christian life believing that the gospel wasn't for me, that I had already figured it out, and that my job was to tell other people about the gospel, but not to listen to it. And I didn't think that I needed Jesus, and I watched my life completely just fall into shambles. And when I got to rock bottom, I found Jesus there. And I have graciously lived there next to him since then. And I tell everyone, come join me. Because when you come to grips with yourself and you find yourself in that place, Jesus is as bright as he could ever be, and you are at more peace than you could ever be. And that's a crazy thing to think, that in your worst moments is when you're going to find the most peace. But as we'll see as we talk about the gospel this morning, you'll see that some things are kind of backwards with the gospel. In our worst moments, we find Jesus, and with Jesus comes this extraordinary peace. So this morning, what we're going to talk about and what we're going to kind of dive into is just the simple gospel itself. So for the past few months, we've been discussing the book of Mark, or the Gospel of Mark, and we called that sermon series The Simple Gospel. But 5 months into it, it probably doesn't seem that simple. Because when you're going through passages verse by verse by verse, it kind of is easy to get lost down in that, and things can feel complicated. And we've even heard jokes. We've even made the jokes ourselves that this sermon series isn't that simple, even though it's called The Simple Gospel. So as we're preparing to move into December and to the Christmas season, we were discussing as a staff, and we decided that what we'd like to do is wrap up the Simple Gospel series a little bit early so that we could do something special for the Christmas season. And when we were doing that, Pastor Mike said, well, would you like to take the last couple of weeks to sum up the simple gospel, to sum up the book of Mark, and bring us back to that moment where the gospel is actually simple? And I said yes. I didn't realize that was going to be as hard as it was, but I said yes. So I get the honor to be with you guys this week and next week to talk about the simple gospel. So this week we're going to discuss what is the simple gospel, and then next week, I know that I'm speaking, but I encourage you to come back because we're going to move past what is the simple gospel into advancing the simple gospel. And I'm really excited about this morning and next Sunday morning. So what is the simple gospel? Well, as we look at the book of Mark, you'll see, if you do any study in the book of Mark, you'll realize that we didn't come to the name of this sermon series by accident, okay? Mark, when he was sitting down, when he was writing his book, however his writing process was going, he had this target audience in mind that was not specific. His audience was very general. All of the other gospels, they have a specific audience. They have a specific goal in mind, but Mark's actually was very broad. His goal was to tell the story of Jesus to the Gentiles and the nations in a way that people without Jewish backgrounds could understand it. So his goal was to actually simplify the story of Jesus so that anyone from any background, from any nation, from any language could understand it. So when we were looking at the book of Mark and we decided on a sermon series, we weren't just making a throwback to a song that we like. We were really trying to capture, just like Mark did, the simplicity of the story of Jesus and how it applies to our lives. And as we look at the entire book of Mark this morning in kind of really broad strokes, we're going to find that the gospel is simple in three ways. So it's simple in what it means. That's the first way. And then it's simple in who it is for. That's the second way. And then finally, the third way is simple in how it's received. Now, what you'll realize with these three things as we kind of walk along that is that those three things build on top of one another. As one of them becomes complicated, the other ones become complicated. It's nearly impossible to see the simplicity of how the gospel is received if you can't see its simplicity in how what it means, right? So we're kind of building up to this moment. That's how we're walking through that today. We're going to walk through each step, and they each kind of talk to one another and build on top of one another. So first, we'll jump into what the simple and what it means. So what does the gospel actually mean? Well, the word gospel, you're all probably very familiar with and familiar that it means good news. But what's interesting about our time is that gospel is almost exclusive to Christianity. People don't come on CNN and go, hey, I've got some gospel for you this morning, right? That's not how they approach it. But back in Jesus' time, the gospel was not a big G. It was a little g. Right? Everyone had a gospel. Caesar would have a gospel. They would literally hand out pamphlets of Caesar's gospel. So his good news, they would pass it throughout Rome that they were telling Caesar's story. So the gospel actually, when we just drill into the word, just means good news. And it can be subjective, and it can be broad, and it can be big, but that's not what the gospel means for us. And so what does it mean for us? Well, we're kind of passing through that, right? We're moving from a little g good news to big G good news. So we kind of stole that word as Christians. We took it and we said, there's no more good news to tell. This is the good news, right? So we made this claim that all of the rest of you that have a gospel, it doesn't mean a thing. It's nothing. We have the gospel. We have the final story that needs to be told. We have the very best story, the very best news that any person could ever hear. So what is that story? Well, it is actually simple. Even though we spend week after week after week talking about it and drilling into it, the story of Jesus is really simple. It is a story of an inadequate group of people who meet an inadequate Messiah or Christ, and they swap places. In him, we become adequate because he picks up our inadequacies. And that's the entire gospel. That's it. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but there's nothing more that needs to be said about it. It is all about Jesus looking at undeserving people and saying, I will go be undeserving so that they will be seen as deserving. Right? Well, if it's that simple, then why does it often seem so complicated in our lives? If what the gospel means is so simple that it can be summed up into a sentence, then why isn't it easy to tell our friends about it, or our coworkers, or even our family members? Why isn't it easy to tell it to ourselves when we wake up in the morning facing a bad day? Well, it's because we lose sight of the simplicity of the gospel and what it means, and I think we do that in two primary ways, right? And so, like I said, we're kind of building into this, and you're going to see that. But the first way that we lose sight of how simple the gospel is and what it means is we start to lower God's standards on our lives, right? So we start to believe that the law is attainable. And we look at all the rules and all the regulations and all the things in the Bible and that God lets out and says, hey, you should do this. And then Jesus kind of takes that to the amplification, right? Because Jesus says, hey, you know you shouldn't murder. And we think, that's pretty easy. I'm not going to kill anyone today. And then Jesus says, that's great. Don't murder, but also don't get angry, because every time you get angry, you've murdered someone. And then you think, well, crap, I've murdered like 15 people today. Because I was driving on a 485 and 15 people cut me off and I got really angry every single time. So the standards get really high, but what happens is we start to lower those standards. And we start to think that God's commands are executable on our lives and that if we just try hard enough, we can do it. But the truth is, the standards are impossibly hard. It's a standard that is extremely high. In fact, there's only been one person in history that has ever met these standards, and that's from Adam on till today, and I can guarantee you that no one else is going to meet him going forward. Right? And we haven't, Pastor Mike has driven in those standards to us perfectly in the last 2 weeks. His last two sermons did set this up in the most incredible way. So 2 weeks ago, he starts in Mark chapter 9, right? And he tells us the story that if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your feet causes you to sin, cut it off, right? And then, while that seems most difficult enough, as we all sit here sinners with all of our eyes, hands, and feet, he took that to an even higher level and explained to us that that story wasn't just about your eyes and hands and feet, but it was about your possessions and your power and your pursuits. So he literally says that if you have a pursuit, if you have a dream, say you want a promotion, and that promotion is causing you to sin, then your job is to cut the promotion out of your life. If your job is causing you to sin, you've got to quit. Now that is a standard that is really high when you're looking at your family and your food and your mortgage and your car payments. We start to go, well then how can we be Christians? That's impossible. If I have to quit my job because it caused me to sin, my boss causes me to sin every single day. Right? The standards are really, really high. And then we thought we were going to get a reprieve, and we go into Mark chapter 10 and the standards get even higher. Because we see the story of a rich man who comes to Jesus and he says, I've met all of your standards. What do I have to do to join you? And Jesus says, you have to sell everything you own and come with me. And the rich man leaves. And the disciples were astonished, like we would have been, right? And Jesus looks at them astonishingly and said, I told you that this is impossible. Okay, and then Pastor Mike, once again, does what he's supposed to do, and he takes that impossibility to the nth degree and explains to us that you can't escape that through worldly riches. You don't get to look at yourself and go, well, I'm not as rich as that person, so maybe I'm not a wealthy person. And he explained to us that wealth back then wasn't just about the amount of money you have, but it was about where you found your securities. And when you find security in something other than Jesus, he's going to call you to remove it from your life. Now, if that's what was being said, you would look at Jesus astonished too. So if you feel safe in your 401k, Jesus is telling you to empty it and give it to him. Now think about that for a second. Especially those of you that are preparing for retirement, think about the standard that is being set right now. We tell ourselves that the standards aren't that high. We tell ourselves that the standard is read your Bible every day, pray, don't cuss, don't drink, and try to smile. Maybe invite a couple people to church. But the standard is way higher than that. The standard is if retirement makes you feel safe, don't retire. In America, you might get put in a home for doing something like that. So the standards are really, really high, right? And Jesus even says that. He said, and he tells us how impossible it is, right? He says it's more likely for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven or a secure man to get into heaven, right? So let me put that in 21st century terms. It's more likely for a semi-truck to get into your charger port than it is for someone secure and someone other than Jesus to get into heaven. It's impossible, okay? The good news is, the simplicity of the gospel is that the story doesn't end there. That's not the end. That's not even the end of the rich man's story. And it's definitely not the end of ours, right? And that's the second way that we lose sight of the simplicity of the gospel, is that we lose sight that Christ is constantly taking our place. See, Jesus goes on to say, as the disciple, because what is the disciples' response in Mark chapter 10? We went over last week. What do they say? Jesus says all this crazy stuff, and they look up at him, and they're thinking the same thing you're thinking right now, which is, then who gets to be saved? If literally I can't be secure in anything, then who gets to be saved? And Jesus responds with man, it's impossible, but with God, it is possible. And Jesus was driving home this understanding, and we'd seen it many, many times throughout the gospel. He was driving home that he was the answer, not yourself. And he's constantly taking our place. But the problem is, these two things are deeply connected, right? So when we start to lose sight of the fact that Christ is taking our place, we feel this deep urge to lower God's standards on our lives. Because the reason, we start to think, well, Jesus isn't doing this for me, so I have to make it doable for myself so that I can start to do that. And things really start to get complicated. The story changes from an inadequate group of people met by an adequate Christ and swapping places to an adequate group of people met by a more adequate Christ, and they may swap places sometimes. And that really changes it from the good news to the decent news. It's just okay. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to the outside world when you say, my life is great, but this life is better, even though it has all of these restrictions and rules and seemingly regulations on it, but I'm going to do it anyways. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so the simplicity of the gospel starts to get really complicated, and we start to lose sight of what it means. We start to lose sight of what the story actually is. But when we realize that God's standards are impossible, and that we can't meet them, but luckily Christ is constantly standing in our place, meeting them for us, the gospel becomes really simple. And then it makes sense to people. Now, they may not agree with you, but it makes sense when you say, my life was in complete shambles, and I showed up at the feet of Jesus, and nothing got better, but I'm a lot happier. Like, that makes sense. They're like, okay, well then, at least I'm not going to tell you not to follow him, because at least you're happy now. Right? And once we begin to understand that, then we can move on to the second point, which is the gospel is simple in who it's for. Now, just understanding that doesn't keep us from trying to complicate it. Who the gospel is for is a rather complicated thing. We have entire sects of Christianity who spend all of their time debating and arguing, trying to figure out who the gospel is actually for. And if you spend a lot of time in church, you'll talk to a lot of Christians who will tell you stories that they were Christians for years, and they forgot that the gospel was for them, just kind of like I did this morning. They start to think that the gospel is a tool that they can use to bring other people to their membership club, and they've forgotten about the gospel actually applying to them. But if we're going to claim that the gospel, if we're going to declaim who the gospel is for is a simple thing, then we have to know who the gospel is for. And in the call of Levi in Mark chapter 2, Jesus captures that again. I mean, he really is setting us up, letting us understand his story, right? So Jesus is sitting with Levi, who's a tax collector. And he's sitting at this table with a bunch of other bad people. Tax collectors, in case you don't know, were bad people back then. What they did was they took money from their own people, stole it, and then gave rest of it to the government. They were not nice people, right? And they were sitting with other sinners. And the Bible actually tells us that Jesus was reclining with these sinners. So we're not talking about a Jesus who was sitting at the table in perfect posture, and we're talking about a guy who was hanging out with these bad people, talking to them, getting to know them, getting to know their life. And the Pharisees said, they challenged that. They were confused by that. And in that confusion, Jesus looks up at them and says, who is it that needs a doctor? Is it the healthy or the sick? Because I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick. I didn't come to call the righteous, I came to call the sinners. And right there, we have our answer. There's very few times that you can ask a question of the Bible and get a very straightforward answer that's not trapped in all of these parables and stories, but this is one of them. When we ask ourselves, who is the gospel for? Jesus makes it very clear the gospel is for sinners. And now we know why we complicate it. Because we stop believing that we're sinners. We start telling ourselves that we get to walk into this room this morning healthy and righteous, but we don't. We're sick and we're sinners. Because healthy and righteous, the standard is impossible. Remember that? See, when you start to complicate, when you forget God's standards and you forget that Christ is in your place, you start to think that you get to be righteous and that it's not Christ's righteousness in you. You start to believe for a second that you can make yourself better and that you walk into this room healthy. And when you do that, things get complicated. It gets complicated. Because then you start to believe that the gospel isn't for me. And when you start to believe that the gospel isn't for me, you start listening to someone else's gospel. You start listening to someone else's good news with a small g. Maybe they're telling you that if you will give them money, your debt will go away. Or maybe they're telling you if you'll just come to this altar, then your cancer will be healed. But what they're not telling you is that sometimes none of those things happen, but Jesus makes all things new inside of your heart, and one day he's going to make your body new as well. They're manipulating you. They're manipulating that you have lost sight of the simplicity of the gospel. They're complicating it so that you'll follow them. But when you remember that you're a sinner, when you remember your place, when we remember that the gospel is for everyone and that it applies to both to sinners and saints and skeptics, the people that have questions, the people who think they've got it figured out, and the people that are literally just at rock bottom, they all need the gospel. Things get really simple. It becomes simple to stand up here in the morning and preach, right? Because all I have to say to you is come to the feet of Jesus, and things are really easy right there. I know no matter what you brought into the room this morning, you didn't bring it righteously, and you need Jesus. And so that gets really simple. And once we're there, once we kind of understand what the gospel means, and once we understand who the gospel is for, we get to move on into the simplicity of how the gospel is received. So we're admitting, all of us are coming to this room, sinners, sick, in need of Jesus. How do we get him? How do we get him? How do we receive it? And more than just receiving it with our ears, how do we receive it here? How do we change our lives to reflect the reception of the gospel? How do we live how Jesus has actually called us to live? How do we live our lives in reflection of these impossible standards? Well, that's the simplest of them all. The problem is that it's not very easy. And what has happened, we've been infiltrated in our church culture by American culture. And American culture teaches you that simple is easy, right? So when Steve Jobs went to build the iPhone, his goal was to make it as simple as possible. Why? So that when someone picked it up, it was easy and intuitive to use. And we've married those two things together. We've made them mutually exclusive. Easy is simple and simple is easy. But the gospel kind of circumvents that. It's not easy in any shape or form, and how to receive it is not easy at all, but it is very simple. In fact, the only way the gospel can be received is in last place. It's that simple. Be last. Die. Have nothing. and you get to receive the gospel, right? But that's not easy. It's not easy to look at your job and think it's not mine. And it could go tomorrow and I would still be okay. Let me take this even deeper. I'll drive into my own heart this morning. It's not easy to look at your spouse and think she's not mine. And she could be gone tomorrow. It's not easy to look at your kids and think they're not mine. And they could be gone tomorrow. You can't find security in those things. The only way to receive the gospel is in complete last place. No security in anything. You can't be in second place or third place. You have to be at that place where you go, I've got nothing to live for. And that's when you can receive the gospel. Now that's not fun. So what do? We complicate it. We start telling ourselves that the way you receive the gospel is through systems and rituals and regulations and liturgies and all of these things, and that even though I don't have it here, if I can just fake it out here, eventually I'll get it in here. And so we tell ourselves, I need to read the Bible more. If I just read the Bible more, then I'll have the gospel. We tell ourselves, I just need to pray more. I just need to get in my prayer closet more. I just need to get on my knees more. And if I do all those things, I'll have the gospel. I just need to be nicer. I just need to invite people to church. And we could go on for days and days and days of all the things that we tell ourselves that we have to do to receive the gospel. But here's the problem. When we do that, we miss the whole point. You see, the story of the rich man goes on to this last place thing. Right? Jesus sums up this entire story by saying the first will be last and the last will be first. But what happens is, and Jesus says this many times throughout the Bible, and because of that, what we do is we take that scripture outside of that paragraph. And we kind of analyze what that means because it's a contradictory statement, doesn't really make a lot of sense, and we dive into that. And we lose the story. Because when Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first, what he's actually doing is still answering the original question of the rich man, how do I follow you? How do I get you? That's the whole story. See, it's the story of a dude who had met all the standards, had done everything he was supposed to do, comes to Jesus and says, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, okay, well then give up everything, be last place. And the disciples were like, well, that's crazy. And Jesus says, I know it's crazy. I told you this was going to be impossible. But the first are going to become last, and the last are going to become first. He's answering for us right there how we receive the gospel, and it's by being last. But when we start complicating things and we start making all of these excuses and doing all of these things, what we're actually doing is taking a posture of firstness subconsciously. We're listening to what Jesus is saying, and we're hearing it as a command of, hey, you're first, but you better be last, because if you don't, I'm going to make you last. When really what he's saying is, hey, you in last place, find hope in me as first place, because I'm coming to be last, and when I get there, I'm going to make you first. This is a declaration of the gospel story, which is a story of inadequate people met by an adequate Christ, and they swap places. This whole thing was about Jesus. And if you doubt that, I challenge you to read Mark 10 without your subheadings. Because the very next story, after the story of the rich man, is Jesus foretelling his death for the third time. They're connected. It's not even the end of the chapter. It's not a new chapter. It's all the same story. Jesus is building up to this moment of, I'm going to go die for you so that you don't die. Because none of you have met these standards. But we can't see that. If we lower our standards and forget that Christ is in our place, and we forget that the gospel is for us and that we're sinners, then of course we're going to believe that we're in first place and not understand the story of lastness at all, and realize that the only way to receive the gospel and to apply it to our lives is to empty ourselves out completely and come to Jesus with nothing. Right? So here's what I'm going to close with. I'm going to tell a story that Jesus told in Luke. And it just drives home sort of this last placeness. And it will help us kind of grasp, okay, what's the practical of this? How do I actually apply that? What do you mean by be last place? Are you telling me to actually go quit my job? Which I'm not, by the way. So Jesus tells the story of a wedding and its banquet. And he talks about the wedding feast table. And so back in their culture, where you sat at the table mattered. And you're probably all familiar with that. But any sort of old culture, the head of the table was the most important part of the table, the most important seat at the table. And the foot of the table was the worst seat at the table. And so where you sat mattered. And Jesus tells us, he says, when you come to the table, don't take the highest seat. Because if you do, then your host has to move you back. And that'll shame you. He said, in fact, take the lowest seat. Because when you take the lowest seat, your host will invite you to come up. Then he moves on to tell the story of a banquet of that wedding. And he talks about how the host, the master, had gathered up all these festivities and done all these things, and he'd built this beautiful banquet, and he sent out invites to everybody in the town. And when the time for the banquet comes, no one's there. And so the master sends out his servants, says, go find out where everyone's at. And they go out, and all these people have all these excuses. One of them says they got a new wife. One of them says the harvest is coming. One of them says one of their oxen has died. Like, they've got all these reasons why they couldn't come to this banquet. And so the master says, okay, go into the streets and find the poor and the hopeless and the broken and offer their invitations to them. And he filled his banquet with the least of these. He filled his banquet with the people who had nothing to believe in but him. This morning, like we talked about, we all bring these heavy weights in here. We all have baggage. Some of us are carrying debt in here. Some of us are carrying divorce in here. Some of us are carrying pain, depression, anxiety. We've got all kinds of things that we carry in here. And all we need is some sort of relief to just make it to tomorrow. Let's not even move on to reading the Bible every day or inviting people to church or any of that other stuff. How do I just wake up in the morning with a smile on my face? How do I just want to be here? We all need that sometimes. And we try to complicate it, but this morning you don't need a 17-step plan or some jacked dude in a suit yelling at you, telling you to have your best life now, or a multi-level marketing scheme that's going to make your life be the best life that you could possibly have. You don't need a better job or a promotion. You don't need more money. All you need is Jesus. It's that simple. The entire gospel is that simple. We have to realize that when we take the posture of first place, when we look at the gospel and complicate it and start to think that the standards can be met by us, we start making excuses when Jesus offers his invitation to come and be free. We start making excuses. I haven't read my Bible enough. I'm too dirty. I looked at porn last night. I argued with my wife last night. I did this bad. I don't have enough money. I can't pay my tithes. You could come up with anything. Every single one of us have spouted an excuse at some point when God invited us to know Jesus. Every single one of us have. But when we come to grips with our own depravity and we face the reality of our own pains and our own baggage, we accept that we are the poor and the hopeless and the broken in the streets. And when that invitation comes, we don't think, I'm not cleaned up enough to come to this banquet. We just show up there and get all the free food. Right? Jesus is inviting you this morning. He's inviting you to bring all the stuff that you don't want to carry. All the stresses. I talked about the bad ones, but let's talk about the good things. He's inviting you to bring the stress of raising your kid the right way. He's inviting you to bring the stress of being a good Christian. He's inviting you to bring the stress of being nice to your neighbors. Right? He's inviting you to bring all of that, from the good and the bad, and he's calling us to this repentance, to this emptyingness, to empty out the bad things of our lives and the good things of our lives, and to leave behind everything that's us, because us, we're not good enough, and to turn to the simple gospel, which is a story of an inadequate people meeting an adequate Christ and swapping places. This morning, I'm asking you to find peace in your inadequacy, because in it, you will find the adequacy of Christ. So as we take communion, be honest with yourself. Be real with what's breaking you. Be real with what's leading you away from the simplicity of the gospel and into the complications of your own works, and bring them to this table. And when you do, remember that through his body and blood, he made a way for you to know his adequacies in your own inadequacies. Let's pray.